A quiet Pensacola night shattered by flames and a tragic discovery. A father brutally murdered in his own home. But the culprits? Not strangers, but his own two young sons. What could drive children to commit such a horrifying act? In this chilling tale of betrayal, loss, and broken family bonds, we uncover the harrowing events that led to the death of Terry King, a father who fought to hold his family together. Join us as we unravel the mystery behind a crime that shocked a nation, revealing the devastating consequences of manipulation, neglect, and misplaced trust. When the flames subsided, the town of Pensacola awoke to a story more horrifying than they could have imagined. A father bludgeoned to death, and his two sons at the center of the tragedy. Was this the ultimate act of rebellion, or were they victims of a dark and manipulative force? As we delve into the case of Terry King, we confront uncomfortable truths about family, betrayal, and the haunting consequences of unhealed wounds. Stay tuned as we navigate the shadows of a crime that asks not just who, but why. In the very early hours of the morning on the 26th of November
911,
in the
what's your
year
emergency?
2000, in a Pensacola town at 1:39 a.m., an anonymous caller reported seeing smoke and fire coming from a nearby property. The fire alarm went out over police radio, summoning the fire department, who raced to the scene of a raging inferno. The first responders arrived to find one side of the house ablaze, most likely where the fire had begun or been started from. The crew make their way into the house to see if there were any trapped survivors. Getting to a door, they find it's locked, so they break it down. They enter to find the still lifeless body of an adult male sitting in a recliner, arms and legs crossed. On closer inspection, they find dried, crusted blood all over his face and on the walls of the crime scene. They could tell right away his death wasn't caused by the fire. This body belonged to that of Terry King. This is a case about a man who was bludgeoned to death in his own home with a baseball bat. What makes this case intriguing is who actually committed this murder. This was a man who at a point in time was known to have said, "People mistake children for objects of personal property. They are not objects. They are little people with feelings and emotions, and those feelings and emotions are very fragile and should be protected and considered." Terry King. In an ironical twist, this macabre deed was actually carried out by none other than his own two children, who were only 12 and 13 at the time of the incident. What could make very young children commit such a brutal act? Such lack of compassion and cruelty displayed. It would have been easier to use a gun. Not to say a crime is less evil based on the type of weapon used, but sometimes the weapon of choice says a lot. Let's delve into the circumstances surrounding this case to find out why this unfortunate event occurred. Pensacola can be found in the Escambia County of southern Florida. Yes, this is the city where one of the world's most infamous serial killers was captured, Ted Bundy. Pensacola has been the origination of quite a few other incidents which have made the headlines, amongst which is the modern-day Bonnie and Clyde. The couple were involved in a spate of robberies across multiple states in 2016. Sadly, one half of the duo lost their life in a standoff with the police. After pleading no contest, Brittany is sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. But this is another story for another case. Terry grew up in the town of Cantonment, a suburb of Pensacola. It's here in 1985 he met Kelly Marino. The couple had been together for 8 years when they welcomed their first child, Derek. A year later, they welcomed yet another child, Alex, into the world. Sadly, this fairy tale life doesn't last, and things begin to go downhill. In 1993, Marino deserted her boys and Terry when they were only 5 and 6 years old. She left to be with another man with whom she had another set of children, twin boys. It's believed the grass wasn't at all greener on the other side, and her new partner beat her, subjecting her to an abusive relationship. Marino fled from her lover and returned to Terry. But soon after she left and abandoned Terry and their 2 sons all over again. Terry, probably without any college education, bounced from one odd job to the next, which paid minimum wage or less. He had a hard time making ends meet. Terry struggled to raise his boys on his own, and as a result, they weren't able to get the home care they needed at such a tender age. This would eventually lead to them being placed in foster homes, Derek at 6 and Alex just 5 years old. Terry lived with his sons on and off due to this arrangement. He placed Derek and Alex in an orphanage where they could be together. Unfortunately, they were struck again with another bout of bad luck, and the orphanage collapsed and was closed down. So Alex and Derek had to be placed in separate homes. After a while, Alex began to develop paranoia. He was returned to live with his father. It was said Terry became overprotective of him and didn't let him go out very much. It wasn't all blue skies with Derek either, as he'd been involved in some misdemeanors. Eventually, some good fortune would smile upon Terry, rewarding him for all his hard work, and he was soon able to rent a house, and Derek returned to live with them. Once more they lived together as one family. It was the fall in 2001. Derek, now 13, had just spent nearly 7 years with his foster parents and returned home to his biological father, Terry, only 2 months before Terry was murdered. Marino, on the other hand, had moved one last time to Kentucky in 1998, where she now lives. Ricky Chavez was a 40-year-old handyman who lived in Pensacola. Ricky had had a very unstable childhood. Just like the King boys, he too came from a broken home, and growing up as a child, he spent time in foster care. In 1984, Ricky was in his mid-20s. He had been accused of sexually molesting a minor, an offense for which he was charged and convicted of. At the time, he worked as a security guard for a hotel and was caught being inappropriate with 2 or 3 young males at the same time. They were all minors. Ricky would later face separate charges for lewd and lascivious act against a minor in October 2001. This minor would be no other than Alex King. Ricky had met Terry at a flea market. It said they became friends, and soon he became a friend of the family. Ricky would assist Terry with money when he needed it, and it's reported Terry had asked Ricky to keep an eye on his boys. It's likely news of Ricky's past wasn't known to Terry, or Terry felt he was a changed man. Alex and Derek began spending a lot of time with Ricky watching TV and playing video games. However, a change in the boy's character didn't go unnoticed by Terry. Alex had become somewhat withdrawn and informal with his father. Terry must have suspected something, because not long after, he told his sons they were no longer permitted to see Ricky. In the days leading up to the murder, the boys had run away from home. It was the 16th of November. Terry had returned to find their possessions gone, along with many knives. Terry had searched for them in the neighborhood, not finding them. He stopped at the local police station and left a statement with the sheriff. Terry might have opened up about his suspicions about Ricky being in possession of his sons. It's reported the sheriff had spoken to Ricky, who denied this allegation. But Ricky did say Alex had called him to say they were not going to return home. It would later be established a call from Alex saying he wasn't going home had been forged by Chavez and Alex. A week later, Derek's former foster parents had spotted Derek 18 miles away and called Terry to tell him this, but Derek didn't want to go home. Eventually, Terry would arrive to pick up Derek. Derek said he'd been hiding out in the woods and that he had no idea where his younger brother Alex was. In actual fact, they had both been with Chavez in his mobile home up until the 24th of NOV, the day he'd been found. Seeing this had occurred, Chavez decided to take Alex back home to his father too, and the following day, a day before the murder, Chavez had called Terry to let him know Alex had made contact, and that he was going to pick him up and bring him home as well. A few hours before the attack on his life, Terry had been in a telephone conversation with a friend of his named Tyson. He opened up to his friend and discussed his concerns about his son's activity of late. He said he didn't trust them and that he was suspicious they were plotting something. He couldn't have been more accurate. He felt the need to lock them up securely with deadbolts in separate bedrooms. Sadly, he would never get to do this. He had no idea of the deadly ambush which awaited him. Only a few moments later, on that fateful evening, the two boys, determined to see their murder plot through, waited patiently out of sight for their father to fall asleep. Then Derek, in possession of an aluminum bat with Alex by his side, approached Terry where he sat, asleep in his recliner chair in front of the television. Once close enough, Derek lifts the bat, swings as hard as he can, and hit his father once over the head. The impact of this caused Terry to moan in his sleep, but he didn't wake up. Afraid he'd wake up and catch them in the act, Derek continued to hit him. Derek ended up hitting his father over his head a total of about 10 times. Alex, who stood close by, watched his father's brains splatter as far as 12 feet away onto the walls of the living room. Still not yet dead. In his final seconds, Terry's face puffed in and out with each short breath, the sound of one trying to breathe with a blocked nose, as later described by Alex. The medical examiner would call this the death rattle, a sound which only one around a dying person could describe so well. The dying man struggled to breathe, but sadly, he would never wake from his sleep. After a few moments, Derek and Alex King are convinced their father Terry King is dead. They weren't done just yet. Just before exiting the house, Derek went to his father's room. Placing the bloody aluminum bat down on the bed Terry slept on, he lit the mattress on fire, starting the blaze that would burn down the house they once shared. It's understood they set their house on fire to destroy evidence, an idea they obtained from watching TV shows. As the fire started, they immediately left the house and ran to a pay phone to call Chavis. Chavis came a little while later and picked them up. He drove into a field in the neighboring state of Alabama and made them take off their clothes. The boys got into his trunk on the ride over to Chavis' mobile home. Chavis washed their blood-stained clothes. The trio stayed up late into the night, smoking weed, and then they fell asleep. The next morning, still in hiding from the police, a more mature and experienced Chavis, knowing they couldn't hide from the police forever, and it would only be a matter of time until they're caught, suggests they tell officers they got into a fight with their father, and they killed him in self-defense, and once they were free, they could live with him. Though there were conflicting statements around this, which will be explained later in this episode. The chief medical examiner's autopsy report disclosed the toxicology report was negative for alcohol and harmful drugs. This meant at the time of his death, Terry wasn't under the influence of any chemical compounds, as he hadn't been drinking nor using drugs, and these didn't in any way cause or contribute to his death. Terry's head was fractured in several places with large gouges on his face. The 40-year-old had died as a result of blunt force injuries to the head. His death was confirmed a homicide. Terry King was laid to rest 4 days after he was found murdered. Back at the King's residence, the firemen have battled through the night to put out the flames of the blaze the night before. The police have been called to the scene as not only is there a case for arson, but also a homicide. People who knew this was Terry's residence knew he had 2 sons who were by now nowhere to be found. The police on locating Terry's body began to canvass the neighborhood for the boys. By now, they've reached out to known family of King and notified them of his unfortunate demise. King's relatives were aware of his battle to keep his sons away from Ricky, and the detectives, knowing King had made a report of a certain Ricky Chavis once, were pointed in his direction. It baffled the police as to the relationship this adult had with these 2 young boys. The detectives, on getting to Ricky's house, found it unusually fortified with an iron gate, electrical wires, and CCTV cameras. Whilst talking with Ricky, they noticed he was acting quite unusual. He was uncomfortable and he kept going in and out of the room whilst the detectives were there. This raised their suspicions. However, after searching Ricky's mobile home, the boys were still nowhere to be found. But the boys were certainly there. It was later found out Ricky had hid them in a secret chamber. By the end of the day, Chavis, knowing the heat was up, convinced his young accomplices to turn themselves into the police. The next day, Chavis called the police and informed them he'd found the lads and he was bringing them in. He drove the brothers to the sheriff's office to turn themselves in. The questioning began. The stories given by the boys were inconsistent and constantly changing. Initially, they alleged they were abused by their father and that this was their reason for killing him, and then that they were brainwashed by Ricky Chavis, who, being a friend of Terry's, had carried out the murder to protect them from their father's alleged abuse. They said Chavis convinced them that as juveniles they were likely to get a lesser sentence if they took the rap instead of him. After handing themselves in, the boys were looking at life imprisonment plus 30 years for murder and arson, and on November 28th, they are both charged with murder and detained in a juvenile center. On December 11th, they are indicted on first-degree murder and are held without bond. Chavez is charged as an accessory to murder and for tampering with evidence, and he is jailed. For these crimes, if found guilty, he faces up to 35 years in prison. The following day in court, the brothers plead not guilty, whilst Chavez bond is set at $50,000. As time progressed, when questioned, Alex, now 13, had said, "I felt a little sad about it, a little bit sad, a little relieved that we don't have to go through it. What he put us through again, the abuse." When asked to describe the abusive acts by his father, Alex replied he would sometimes stare down at me with extreme eye contact. Based on this, the conclusion was drawn that there had in fact been no instance of sexual abuse on the part of Terry. Amongst Alex's possessions were his journals detailing his harrowing experiences, by which he may have convinced others of the alleged sexual abuse by his father and of his romantic feeling for Chavez. His writings, despite his young age, appeared to some to be quite sophisticated and rather exposed his imaginative tendencies. In Alex's statement to the police, he insisted Terry wasn't his biological father due to the alleged abuse. He told the police he wished Terry was dead and showed them scratches on his arm his father had made. He told the police they had thought of using a knife, however, they felt this wouldn't penetrate deeply enough, so they thought of using a hammer, but they weren't able to find one. Alex admitted it was his idea to kill their father, so they wouldn't have to live with him anymore. Derek admitted to the police he'd told his foster mom, Ms. Lay, their father was a control freak, and they had a plan to kill him. Derek, being the older brother, would often get in the middle of Alex and their father if he thought Terry was being physically abusive. They described Terry as a no-nonsense man, and if they dared to talk back, he would push them around and state his answer as final. When the two were back home after running away the previous November, their father had yelled at them and began to push them around. This was really frightening, especially to Alex. This was apparently the straw that broke the camel's back. At the end of the saga, it's deduced between the two of them, Alex was in fact the mastermind, and he'd been able to convince his older brother Derek to commit the patricidal act. Their police interviews were consistent in that they both claimed their father had physically and emotionally abused them, and this was their reason for wanting to kill him. During the year-long case, the King's testimony changed several times. After their initial confession on the day of the murder, Alex later testified. Chavez told them he was coming to pick them up on the night of the event. But when Chavez told them he had killed their father, he was upset by Chavez news. This, however, couldn't be accurate if he described his father's slow death so well. Alex said he and his brother Derek were in the trunk of Chavez's car, while Chavez beat their father to death with the bat. This led to the charges of first-degree murder, which were brought against Chavez. Alex also narrated how Chavez got closer to him during the days they stayed with him when they ran away from home. Alex said Chavez told him the history of his involvement with younger boys, saying it's normal for boys and men to kiss. Alex went on to say they slept on Chavez's bed during their stay, and Chavez had given them marijuana, and whilst Chavez didn't give them cigarettes, he didn't try to stop them from smoking either. Alex said this is when he fell in love with Chavez, that Chavez had said he loved him, and they, Alex and Chavez himself, were gay, and only he, Chavez, understood him. Alex testified this abuse began when he was 12 years old, and Chavez had put him on his laps. On another occasion, Alex told yet another version. Alex said they had hid in the woods for days before calling Chavez. However, this was disproved by the police investigations, and it was confirmed the boys had called Chavez soon after they had battered their father to death. Alex later said, when Chavez had picked them up and taken them to his mobile home, the three of them stayed up all night smoking marijuana, and all morning the following day working on the story they would give investigators. This was when Chavez said they should take the fall as they'd get off on a lighter sentence. Eventually, Alex admitted to plotting the killing, and Derek admitted he swung the bat. Both boys agreed despite their torrid relationship with their father. They were never frequently slapped around or spanked, eliminating the prospect of severe physical abuse in this case. In court, Derek's former foster mom testified he'd informed her 2 days before the murder of their plot to kill their father, the very day he was found after he and his brother Alex ran away from home the week before. This testimony confirms this was premeditated, and the boys were definitely aware of what was happening. Chavez admitted to hiding the boys and washing their clothes, but he denied any sexual act ever took place. However, in later confessions, Derek would say he witnessed Chavez kissing Alex while Alex sat on his lap. They would skip school playing truant and go to his place. They would smoke marijuana and cigarettes. Notes Alex had written were found. Rick told me he loved me, Alex wrote. Rick told me I was gay, and only he understood me. After comparing these notes with the ones found in their home, and noting the misspellings were not present, the prosecutor addressed the discrepancies as Alex's attention-seeking strategy to attract more sympathy. As the days progress, whilst the boys were in prison, it's reported Alex began to self-harm, and Derek threatened to electrocute himself, so they were put into separate cells. In subsequent interviews and interrogation, the boys recanted their earlier confession to killing Terry King and put the blame on Chavez. Due to this, on April 9, Chavez is charged with first-degree murder, arson, and lewd and lascivious act upon a child. He is held without bond. Their trials were set for August 26th, with Chavez's beginning first. At their trial, Alex and Derek testified Chavez had killed Terry while he and his brother were in his trunk. The prosecution rested. However, when the tape of them confessing to the murder is played, they were found guilty, and on September 6th, both brothers are found guilty of second-degree murder. They faced 22 years to life. Chavez is found not guilty of first-degree murder and arson, but remained in jail pending other charges. Kelly, their biological mother, was at the hearing and had requested for their defense attorneys to be replaced. She also asked for her sons to be psychologically examined, as she didn't believe they were competent to enter a plea. However, the prosecutor refused to replace the King boys' defense and didn't permit Kelly with her team of attorneys to participate in the hearing. He also insisted the boys were intelligent enough to enter a plea. The state prosecutor didn't believe Marino has legal standing to act on the boys' behalf, stating, had she paid more attention to them in their play pens, they wouldn't be going to the state pen. On October 17th, following the decision of the jury to convict them of second-degree murder and arson, the judge claimed the trial had violated the boys' right to due process. The judge threw out the boys' convictions, stating they were unfair, and he reversed the decision ordering plea negotiations. This came as pleasant news to relatives of the King family and also their defense team. On November 14th, the boys pled guilty to a lesser charge of third-degree murder and arson in return for a reduced sentence. Barely into their teens, the boys' lives had been disrupted by a neglectful mother, a father who emotionally and mentally abused them and struggled to raise them, foster care, and eventually their involvement with a pedophile and convicted sex offender. The judge recognized the instability in the boys' lives and how important it was to give them back some stability. They were keen on placing them in institutions where they had access to educational programs and mental health treatment so they could rebuild their lives. Derek was sentenced to 8 years in prison, and Alex was sentenced to 7 years in prison. They were both to serve in a state prison for offenders less than 18 years of age. The judge and state prosecutor determined there was minimal evidence to indicate Chavez killed King, or that he in any way encouraged them or aided them in the commission of the act. On August 30th, a verdict in Chavez's trial had been reached after deliberation for 5 hours. However, Chavez still faced further charges for accessory after the fact and tampering with evidence, and secondly, a charge of lewd and lascivious assault on Alex, where as part of his plea agreement, Alex agreed to testify truthfully at both trials. However, due to lying to the grand jury, his jury, and Rick jury, there was doubt anything further the boys say would be believed. On February 12, 2003, Chavez is acquitted of charges of sexual molestation, but is found guilty of falsely imprisoning Alex, and the judge sentenced him to the maximum 5 years in prison, calling his actions unconscionable. On March 5th, the jurors find Chavez guilty of being an accessory after the fact and of tampering with evidence. He is sentenced to the maximum of 35 years and isn't expected to be released until April 2036. The King's relatives insisted they were just kids, not hardened criminals despite their crime. They argued that the boys shouldn't be seen as hardened criminals, as there was a chance they could be rehabilitated. Others remained in denial, unable to accept their loved ones were responsible. The investigators at the scene were under a lot of heat from people who actually believed the boys were innocent. They believed that it was due to the negligence of the investigators at the scene that they were unable to prosecute Chavez, who they believe was the actual perpetrator of the crime. The investigator, however, said, "The boys were unremorseful and unregretful. They never said sorry." There's nothing in this story, or that has been revealed, that justifies their crime of passion. And it's difficult to understand why these kids who appeared, according to the reports of many, were well-clothed, well-fed, and well-nurtured. They came from a good home, they attended a good school possibly, yet harbored a deadly hatred for their father. Unlike similar stories where a taste for the affluent and excessive lifestyle contributes to a greedy appetite for material possessions, fuels the parasital urges of unruly offspring. Some surmise their father's efforts to keep them away from a convicted child molester cost him his life. They may not have been wealthy, evidenced by the fact they were placed in foster homes, and with their early years riddled with so much misfortune, seem to have been the classic pattern for the development of antisocial behavioral disorders. There may have been abandonment issues early on, stemming from their mother leaving them and their father on numerous occasions, which were neglected. This may have been one of the underlying causes of their violent and unemotional character. Terry, similarly, may also have suffered emotionally in his life, developing anger issues as a result of his turbulent marriage and failure to provide for his family. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try, some kids still end up being very dangerous and unruly, but there's no smoke without fire. Some believe the allegations of familial and sexual abuse were all lies, and will never really know their true motive. It appears they may have taken a liking to Chavez because, unlike Terry, he was quite relaxed with disciplining them. It's possible there really was no abuse in form of sexual molestation by their father Terry at all, and that the boys were just not happy with their father's seemingly strict way of nurturing. From the wider, more distant public, people gave account of how well-dressed, healthy, and clean the boys looked, which is what made this murder case, amongst many others involving juveniles, to stand out. They weren't your typical sort of boys, if you know what I mean. It may have been Terry's difficult upbringing that would cause him to act somewhat uncompassionately towards his sons, for them to seek bloody revenge, and that he was probably just a good man doing his very best to raise his boys right after all. Closer to home, in the days or hours prior to their attack on their father, the boys were known to have announced their murderous plot publicly amongst their peers. There sure was a lot of controversy around this case, with opposing opinions on the innocence of the two youngsters. A book titled A Perversion of Justice, A Southern Tragedy of Murder, Lies and Innocence Betrayed, written by co-authors Molly Barrows and Catherine Medico, was published on May 25, 2004, arguing on behalf of the King boys' innocence. It's quite tragic Mr. Terry King's life was ended prematurely, just when he was beginning to pull things together for himself, so he could be with his sons. He seemed to be trying so hard to do his best for them, and sadly, he will never get to see his boys all grown, a thought any parent would cherish. Likewise, the boys will always live with the memory of their father's last moments and knowing they were responsible. On the bright side, Alex was freed in April 2008 and moved to Jacksonville. He enrolled in community college the following year. He has had to deal with a share of troubles, but he is making strides with bettering himself and being part of the community. Derek was freed in March 2009, and while he was in prison, he inspired members of the public to found a redemption project aimed at assisting children who have murdered their parents in reintegrating into society. While in prison, the King's brothers had no shortage of empathy from concerned members of the public, who sent them books, money, and even paid them visits in prison. Some were even said to have paid some of their legal costs during their trial. They were interviewed in 2013 and were happy with looking forward to moving on with their lives while remaining positive.